Section 6. Apprehending independent reality. In terms of how quantum theory deals with macro objects, Hodgson says that these can be adequately represented by a state function, leaving consciousness aside. This is because a macro object needs to be considered only in relation to its interactions, and its state function can adequately account for all its interactions with other systems. But if the macro object in question is conscious, then a form of representation is needed which does more than merely account for its interactions with other systems. A state function of a conscious macro, such as a human brain, has not been interpreted so as to account for either consciousness itself or the occurrence and sequence of conscious events. On the other hand, neither has a classical representation of such an object. Accordingly, one need not suppose that the representation of a brain by means of a state function is any less adequate to account for consciousness than is the classical representation of it as a material object. In other words, trying to account for consciousness in terms of the brain as a classical object would require postulating that some pattern of events involving its component parts would somehow also involve conscious events. Hodgson claims that I would think one could suggest with at least equal plausibility that it is rather some patterns of quantum potentialities that some patterns of quantum potentialities involve conscious events. In other words, rather than trying to explain conscious events via the movements of classical objects in the brain, perhaps the movements of classical objects in the brain can be explained via conscious events. In this quantum way of seeing things, matter and consciousness are held to be two realities in themselves, which are capable of mutual interaction. The two concepts have certain things in common, but it's clear that they can't be identified. De Spagner states clearly that consciousness, as I think of it, cannot in any way, for straightforward reasons of logical coherence, be reduced to a mere property of matter. For it is consciousness which, in a sense, carves out the atoms within the body of reality. However, consciousness achieves this by means of operations such as deploying an instrument or observing a signal, which, as de Spagner comments, have nothing particularly reflexive about them. Consequently, animals could thus quite well be channels of such thought too. Phenomena, therefore, says de Spagner, include an important component contributed by human beings, in the sense that it is our perceptual and intellectual faculties which in large measure demarcate these phenomena within the body of the real. As he says, this raises the classical philosophical problem of causal relations, i.e., which is the cause and which the effect. The traditional answer has been that the cause comes before the effect. However, in quantum reality, a cause is a phenomena which is directly dependent on us. This is the answer to Vellman's objection to conscious causation, as quoted in the previous unit. Experiments reviewed by Libet, 1996, for example, suggest that it takes at least 200 milliseconds for neuronal states adequate to support a conscious experience to form. In short, consciousness of an external event takes place later in time than the event itself. If so, how could the resulting conscious experience affect its prior cause? This would seem to require backward causation in time. Quote from Vellman's. But, as we have seen, de Spagna is clear that in quantum physics, consciousness is necessarily prior to phenomena. De Spagna claims that by following these quantum principles, we now have a solidly based idea of an independent reality that is neither totally inaccessible nor totally reducible to trivial notions. However, he then turns to what philosophers have referred to as an immediate apprehension of the thing itself, and further claimed that such an apprehension is ultimately the truest communication human beings can have with the real. What can we make of such a notion? De Spagna asks. He answers that it's ambiguous and heavy with erroneous meanings and possibly illusions. We might, he suggests, assume that an object we apprehend is simply a physical object, localized, singular, and unique, and that this object truly constitutes an element of reality itself. But, he says, such a return to near realism can only be accepted by minds ignorant of physics. However, looking at it from another angle, how could we remain insensible to the impression of direct communication with the localized singular object evoked by the philosophers concerned, and from which artists, poets, and composers draw their finest inspirations? Ultimately, the most precious part of our lives. Are we obliged by our other knowledge to range such impressions under a rubric similar to that to which we allocate optical illusions? By no means. It is obvious, though nevertheless it is worth stating, that the hypothesis according to which some particular impressions of this kind are indications of truths about reality in itself cannot be refuted. Not only, says de Spagna, do we need to give up the conception of physical realism, in which the notions of independent and empirical reality are conflated, but it also seems probable that reality in itself is prior to space-time. At any rate, he says, the tension between quantum physics and the notion of locality makes the idea that effectively this is so seem plausible. Under the circumstances, then, we must recognize that although the reversibility of time of mathematical physics remains a quite essential element in a set of immensely effective calculation rules, its ontological status appears nonetheless precarious. It is not an element of independent reality, and as an element of empirical reality, it has to give way to irreversible time, at least in respect of most of the phenomena we normally refer to by that term. Irreversible time seems inevitable in our day-to-day experience. In other words, time belongs to the world of phenomena and is therefore part of empirical reality. Consequently, as with all elements of empirical reality, it cannot be simply assumed to be a feature of independent reality. But in contrast with reversible mathematics, Despagna suggests that it is not absurd to speak, albeit loosely, of irreversible time as being more real than the reversible kind. And this, he says, provides justification for those philosophers who identify true time with the consciousness human beings have of time. The advent of quantum mechanics represented a transition from independent reality to empirical reality, and finally revealed, as Despagna claims, the existence of veiled reality. Classical physics was firmly convinced that reality was independent. Positivists and the Copenhagen school have contented themselves with empirical reality. What is clear, however, is that the empirical reality of quantum physics is not the reality of everyday experience. Non-locality, entanglement, etc., etc. Another interpretive strategy by Dennett and others in favor of realism has been to try to limit the quantum realm to the subatomic level. Those who don't accept the existence of this boundary insist that we need to move on to consider the nature of the veiled reality underlying observed phenomena. But exploring this deeper level of reality cannot be done using empirical methods, not at least within the present scientific paradigm, and perhaps never. Removing the veil from the deeper levels of reality demands a move into metaphysics. As we shall see, Stapp suggests that the ontology developed by Alfred North Whitehead can provide a basis for grappling with this problem. We'll look at this in Unit 8.